That morning, I never expected my life to shift because of one envelope. It was not a bill. It was a lawsuit from my parents. They sued me for refusing to sell the apartment I purchased with 10 years of savings to fund my sister's divorce. Have you ever been dragged to court by family? What I discovered during this battle made them unable to look me in the eye ever again. My name is Sophie Anderson. I am 33 years old, and for the last 7 years, I have worked as a senior risk analyst at Harborline Advisory, a firm that specializes in telling wealthy corporations exactly how and when their decisions will blow up in their faces. My job is not to be pessimistic. My job is to be accurate. I look at unstable variables. I calculate the probability of catastrophic failure, and I advise on how to mitigate the damage. I am very good at what I do because I do not rely on hope. I rely on data. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the city center. It is a space of clean lines, gray tones, and absolute silence. It is not a gift. It is not an inheritance. It is the physical manifestation of 10 years of 80-hour work weeks, missed holidays, and a savings account that I guarded with the ferocity of a starving wolf. Every square inch of this floor, every pane of glass in the floor-to-ceiling windows, belongs to me. My name is on the deed. My name is on the mortgage. My name is the only one on the mailbox. Or so I thought until 6 o'clock this morning. The sun had barely crested the skyline when the buzzer rang. It was not a friend. I do not have friends who visit at dawn. It was a courier, a man with a tired face and a clipboard who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. He asked for me by name. I confirmed my identity. He handed me a thick manila envelope, mumbled something about having a nice day, and left. I stood in my hallway, the heavy paper cool against my fingertips. I did not open it immediately. My heart rate did not spike. In my line of work, panic is an inefficiency. I walked to my kitchen island, placed the envelope on the marble counter, and poured my coffee. Only then did I slide a letter opener under the flap and slice it open. I pulled out the stack of documents. The header was bold and centered. Superior Court of the State of New York. Plaintiffs: Richard Anderson and Elaine Anderson. Defendant: Sophie Anderson. I stared at the names, my father, my mother, and me. I took a sip of black coffee and began to read. The legal jargon was dense, designed to intimidate, but I speak the language of contracts and liabilities fluently. I parsed through the clauses, the allegations, and the demands. It took me less than 5 minutes to understand the architecture of their attack. It was a civil suit. My parents were suing me for what they termed unjust enrichment and breach of an implied familial contract. The document claimed that my success, my education, and my current financial stability were direct results of their sacrifices and investments during my upbringing. Therefore, they argued, they held an equitable interest in my assets. Specifically, they were asserting a claim over my primary residence. They wanted the court to force the sale of my apartment. The reason was buried on page 4, paragraph 12. It stated that the family was facing an urgent financial crisis due to the marital dissolution of my younger sister, Megan. It alleged that the costs of her legal representation and the preservation of her standard of living required immediate liquidity. The lawsuit argued that as the eldest daughter who had benefited from the family resources, I had a legal and moral obligation to liquidate my assets to prevent the family from falling into destitution. I put the paper down. The apartment was quiet. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to scream. What I felt was a cold, sharp clarity, the kind that descends on me when I'm staring at a spreadsheet that shows a company is hemorrhaging millions while the CEO buys a new yacht. They were not asking for help. They were not calling to explain that Megan was in trouble and asking if I could contribute. They had skipped the conversation entirely and gone straight to the nuclear option. They were trying to use the law to break into my life and strip the copper wiring from the walls. I looked at the phrasing again. Filial duty, implied contract of support, moral obligation. It was fascinating. In a morbid way, they had weaponized my childhood. Every meal they had put on the table, every ride to school, Every basic parental responsibility was now being itemized as a loan that had come due. They were rewriting history. In their version, they were the benevolent investors, and I was the ungrateful startup that had failed to pay dividends. The reality, of course, was different. I had left home at 18 with a scholarship and a suitcase. I had worked 3 jobs through college. I had paid off my own student loans. When I bought this apartment, my father had sneered at the location, and my mother had asked why I needed so much space if I did not have a husband. They had contributed exactly $0 to this property. But the truth does not matter in a lawsuit until you can prove it. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city. The morning traffic was starting to build, a river of red taillights and yellow taxis. I thought about Megan. My sister was 29 years old. She had never held a job for longer than 6 months. She married a man she had known for 8 weeks, a man my parents adored because he drove a luxury car, even though I had pointed out that the car was a lease and his business model was essentially a pyramid scheme. Now, apparently, that marriage was imploding. And instead of letting Megan face the consequences of her adult decisions, my parents were trying to cannibalize my life to cushion her fall. This was a transfer of risk. That is what we call it in the industry. My parents had made a bad investment in Megan's lifestyle, and now that the market had crashed, they were trying to offset their losses by raiding a performing asset. Me. I returned to the counter and flipped to the last page. The signature block. Richard Anderson, Elaine Anderson. Their signatures were shaky, perhaps from age, or perhaps from the adrenaline of betraying their own daughter. I could pick up the phone. I could call my mother. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. She would cry. She would say that they had no choice. She would say that family helps family. She would say that I had so much and Megan had so little. And didn't I feel ashamed to live in luxury while my sister suffered? She would try to negotiate. She would say that if I just signed over the deed or took out a second mortgage to give them the cash, they would drop the lawsuit. They would frame it as mercy. But I knew better. I looked at the date on the filing. It had been submitted 3 days ago. They had planned this. They had sat down with a lawyer, paid a retainer, and drafted this narrative while I was at work, while I was sleeping, while I was living my life assuming that the people who raised me loved me. You do not sue someone you love. You sue an adversary. You sue a breach of contract. You sue a liability. By serving me these papers, they had defined the relationship. We were no longer family. We were opposing counsel. I checked the time. It was 6:45 in the morning. I had to be at the office by 8. I had a portfolio review with a client who was worried about currency fluctuation in the Asian markets. I finished my coffee. I washed the mug and placed it in the drying rack. Then I walked to my bedroom and opened my closet. I chose my suit carefully. Navy blue, sharp tailoring, silk blouse, armor. I sat at my vanity and applied my makeup. My hand was steady. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were the same shade of brown as my father's. My chin had the same stubborn set as my mother's. But the person looking back at me was a stranger to them. They thought they were suing a daughter who could be guilt-tripped into submission. They thought they were suing a scared little girl who would do anything to avoid a public scandal. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten that I analyze threats for a living. I break down complex structures and find the structural weakness. I find the rot, and I cut it out. I was not going to hire a family mediator. I was not going to send flowers. I was going to treat this exactly as it was presented to me. This was a hostile takeover attempt. I picked up the lawsuit and slid it into my leather briefcase, right next to my laptop. The apartment was silent as I walked to the door. I paused for a second, my hand on the cool metal of the handle. This was my home. I had bought it with the money I earned from sleepless nights and high-pressure decisions. I had bought it to be safe. They wanted to take it. They wanted to sell it to pay for a divorce that had nothing to do with me. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. I locked the deadbolt behind me. The click of the lock echoed in the corridor. It sounded final. I did not know it yet, but that click was the sound of the bridge burning. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and checked my email on my phone. I had work to do. If my parents wanted a legal battle, I would give them one, but I would not fight with emotions. I would not fight with tears or screaming matches in the living room. I would fight with the truth, and the truth, I suspected, was far uglier than the lie they had printed on these legal documents. I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, cutting off the view of my front door. I was ready. The drive to my parents' house in the suburbs usually takes 45 minutes. Today, I made it in 30. I did not speed because I was anxious. I sped because I wanted this over with. After the lawsuit arrived, my mother had sent a text message. It was brief, punctuated with a heart emoji that felt like a slap in the face. It said that we should all sit down and talk things over like a family. It said they wanted to find a solution that did not involve a judge. It was an olive branch wrapped in barbed wire. I knew exactly what it was. It was an ambush. I pulled my car into the driveway of the house where I grew up. The lawn was manicured. The white siding was spotless. It looked like the perfect American dream, the kind of house where people baked cookies and supported each other. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. My armor was still in place. My expression was neutral. I was not a daughter visiting her parents. I was a professional walking into a hostile negotiation. When I opened the front door, the smell of roasted chicken hit me. It was a sensory trigger, designed to transport me back to being 10 years old, to a time when I relied on them for survival. My mother, Elaine, was waiting in the hallway. She was wearing a soft, pastel cardigan and wearing a look of carefully cultivated distress. She reached out to hug me. I did not step into the embrace. I stood still, my briefcase heavy in my hand. She froze, her arms hovering in the air, then dropped them with a sigh that suggested I was being difficult. "Come in. Sophie," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone is at the table." I followed her into the dining room. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table. He did not stand up. He nodded at me, a gesture one might give to a subordinate who was late for a meeting. My sister, Megan, sat to his right. She looked like a tragedy. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was shredding a paper napkin into tiny, snowy piles on the mahogany table. But it was not the people that drew my attention. It was the centerpiece. In the middle of the table, where the roast chicken should have been, there was a neat stack of documents. Next to them sat 3 pens. I pulled out the chair opposite my father and sat down. I did not take off my coat. "Thank you for coming. Sophie," my father said. His voice was deep, authoritative. It was the voice he used when he wanted to remind everyone that he was the patriarch, the captain of the ship. "We need to settle this matter regarding the apartment." I placed my hands on the table, clasping them together. "You mean the matter regarding the lawsuit you filed against me?" Elaine sat down next to Megan and placed a hand on my sister's shoulder. "Sophie, please, we don't want to fight. The lawsuit is just a formality. We had to do something to get your attention. You have been so distant lately, so focused on your career. You have forgotten that people need you." I looked at the papers in the center of the table. I reached out and pulled the stack toward me. My father watched me, his eyes narrowing, but he did not stop me. I flipped through them. It was not a settlement agreement. It was a surrender. The top document was a power of attorney, granting Richard Anderson full control over my real estate assets. Beneath that was a listing agreement with a local real estate agent, pre-filled with the details of my apartment, and below that was a distribution plan. I read the numbers. The plan outlined the immediate sale of my home. The proceeds were to be deposited into a joint account managed by my parents. There was a line item for me: $5,000 for moving expenses. The rest, estimated at nearly $600,000 after closing costs, was labeled as Familial Stabilization Fund. I looked up. "You have already drafted the listing," I said. "You have even picked the listing price. It is $20,000 below market value. You are looking for a quick sale." "We are in a crisis," Richard said, leaning forward. He tapped the table with his index finger. "Megan is in a crisis. Her husband is a shark. Sophie, He is going to leave her with nothing. We need liquidity to fight him. We need to secure Megan's future." I looked at Megan. She refused to meet my eyes. She stared at the shredded napkin, sniffing rhythmically. "Megan," I said, my voice was calm. "Who is your lawyer?" Megan flinched. She looked at our mother. Elaine answered for her. "We are interviewing several top firms, but these people require retainers. Sophie, huge retainers, $50,000 just to open the file. And then there is the alimony battle. Megan needs a place to live. She needs therapy. She is fragile." I turned my gaze back to my father. "So you want me to sell my home, the only asset I own, to pay for a retainer fee for a lawyer you have not hired yet?" "It is not just the lawyer," Richard snapped. "It is the principle. We are a family. When one of us is drowning, the others act as a life raft. We paid for your college tuition for the first 2 years. We fed you. We housed you. You are successful now. You have more than you need. A single woman does not need a 2-bedroom apartment in the financial district. It is excessive. It is selfish." I felt a cold smirk touching the corner of my mouth, though I suppressed it. There it was, the entitlement. "I paid you back for those 2 years of college." I said, "I wrote you a check for $40,000 3 years ago. I have the receipt." "That was interest," Richard said dismissively. "That does not cover the emotional investment, the guidance, the structure we gave you. You are treating this like a business transaction. Sophie, that is your problem. You have become cold. I am treating this like a business transaction because you brought a contract to the dinner table." I said. I pointed to the papers. "This is a liquidation plan. You are asking me to bankrupt myself." I looked at Megan again. "Tell me about the divorce. Megan, what are the grounds? Is it infidelity? Abuse? Financial misconduct?" Megan let out a sob. It sounded practiced. He is just impossible," she stammered. "He wants everything. He said he is going to destroy our family's reputation if I don't pay him off." "Pay him off?" I asked, my analyst brain latching onto the phrase. "I thought he was leaving you with nothing. Now you are paying him? Which is it? Is he taking your money, or are you paying him a settlement?" Elaine intervened, her voice rising. "It is complicated. Sophie, you don't understand the nuance of marriage. You are so focused on the technicalities that you are missing the point. Your sister is in danger." "I am focused on the technicalities because you are asking for $600,000 of my money." I said. I picked up the distribution plan again. "This account number listed for the transfer. This isn't a trust account for legal fees. This is a standard joint checking account. Yours and Dad's." "So you don't trust us?" Richard asked. His voice dropped an octave. It was a warning tone. "You think your own parents are trying to steal from you?" I think that in my line of work, if a client asked me to liquidate a prime asset to fund an undefined liability into an unmonitored account, I would tell them they were being scammed. I said, I pushed the papers back toward the center of the table. "I am not selling my apartment." The silence that followed was absolute. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Megan stopped shredding the napkin. Elaine looked at Richard. Richard's face turned a shade of red that I associated with his high blood pressure. He did not yell. He became very quiet. "You are making a mistake," he said. "I don't think I am," I replied. I stood up. "Sit down," Richard commanded. I did not sit. I buttoned my coat. "If you walk out that door," Richard said, pointing a finger at me, "the lawsuit proceeds. We will drag you through the mud. Sophie, we will argue that the money used to buy that apartment came from funds we gave you. Loans that were never repaid. We will tie up that property in litigation for years. You won't be able to sell it. You won't be able to refinance it. We will bleed you dry in legal fees." I looked at him, really looked at him. This was the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle. This was the man who had walked me to the bus stop. And now, he was a man threatening to destroy my financial existence because I refused to be his piggy bank. "You are admitting that the lawsuit is malicious," I said. "You are admitting it is a tool to coerce me." "I am telling you that you have a duty," he shouted, finally losing his composure. You ungrateful child. We made you. Everything you are is because of us. And now you sit there in your designer suit and look down on us? Look down on your sister?" Megan was crying loudly now, her face buried in her hands. Elaine was weeping too, looking at me with eyes full of betrayal. "How can you be so cruel?" Elaine sobbed. "She is your baby sister." I looked at Megan. She was 29. She was not a baby. She was a woman who had made choices, just as I had. "I am not being cruel." I said, "I am being prudent. If Megan needs a lawyer, tell her to have the firm send me the bill directly. I will review it. If it is legitimate, I might contribute. But I will not hand over the deed to my home, and I will not sign a power of attorney." Richard laughed. It was a dry, harsh sound. "You think you can dictate terms to us? You have 1 week, Sophie. 1 week to sign these papers. If you don't, our lawyer files a motion for an emergency injunction. We will freeze your assets. We will make sure your employer knows that you are being sued for fraud and elder abuse." The threat hung in the air. Elder abuse. They were going to frame my refusal to give them money as abuse. That could cost me my security clearance. It could cost me my job at Harborline. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I did not let it show. This was the leverage. This was the real weapon. They were willing to burn my career to the ground to get what they wanted. "I see," I said. I picked up my briefcase. "I will wait for the court date," I said. I turned and walked out of the dining room. Behind me, I heard the sound of glass shattering, as if someone had swept the centerpiece off the table. "You will regret this," my father screamed after me. "You will come crawling back." I walked down the hallway, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cool evening air. My hands were shaking, just a little. I clenched them into fists until the trembling stopped. I got into my car and locked the doors. I did not drive away immediately. I sat there for a moment, replaying the conversation. Something was wrong. The desperation was too high. The threat was too extreme. If Megan was just getting a divorce, why did they need $600,000 immediately? Why did they need it in a personal account? And why was Megan so terrified of answering a single specific question about her husband? My father had called it a crisis, but looking back at their faces, the panic in Elaine's eyes, the aggression in Richard's, the evasiveness in Megan's, it didn't look like a divorce. It looked like a cover-up. I put the car in gear. They had declared war. They thought they had the advantage because they were willing to play dirty. They thought I would fold to protect my reputation. But they had made a critical error. They had given me data. They had given me a timeline. And they had given me a motive to dig. I drove away from the perfect White House, leaving the illusion of family behind me. I had work to do. If they wanted to talk about finances, I was going to open the books, all of them. I returned to my apartment and locked the door behind me. The silence was different now. Before, it had been the silence of solitude. Now, it felt like the quiet of a bunker before an airstrike. I tossed my coat onto the sofa and walked straight to my home office. My father had made a tactical error. He had assumed that because he was the loudest voice in the room, he held all the cards. He had assumed that power was physical, verbal, and intimidation-based. But we live in a digital world, and in that world, Richard Anderson was a tourist. I was a resident. I sat down in front of my triple monitor setup and woke the system. The screens glowed with a cool blue light, illuminating the darkened room. I cracked my knuckles, a habit I had picked up during all-nighters in college, and opened a secure browser window. 5 years ago, my parents had complained about the complexity of managing their retirement accounts and the small rental property they owned in Florida. They were drowning in paper statements and missed tax deadlines. Being the dutiful daughter I was back then, I had set up a centralized digital archive for them. I had scanned their deeds, linked their bank accounts, and organized their tax filings into a secure cloud storage system. I had set myself up as the primary administrator because, at the time, my father could barely attach a PDF to an email without calling me for technical support. I typed in the URL for the cloud service. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. If they had been smart, If they had truly treated me as an enemy from the start, they would have changed the passwords. They would have revoked my administrative privileges. I entered my username. I entered the complex 30-character password I had generated for them years ago. Access granted. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. They had not changed a thing. To them, this digital vault was just a magic box where papers went to disappear. They had forgotten that I held the key. I was not hacking. I repeated this to myself as I navigated the dashboard. I was an authorized administrator accessing a system I had built, using credentials that were legally mine. If they wanted to sue me for breach of privacy later, they would have to explain why they left the front door wide open while inviting me in. I initiated a full backup, every tax return, every bank statement, every email archived in the system began to download onto an encrypted external hard drive. The progress bar crawled across the screen. While the data siphoned out, I opened the folder labeled Financials, Current Year. I needed to construct a cash flow model. My parents claimed they were destitute. They claimed the family was facing a financial apocalypse. In my line of work, we have a saying, the numbers never lie, only the people who enter them. I pulled up their primary joint checking account statements for the last 12 months and exported them into a spreadsheet. I began to categorize the data: fixed costs, variable costs, discretionary spending, income streams. The first anomaly appeared almost immediately. According to the lawsuit, my parents were leveraging my apartment because they had exhausted their liquid assets. Richard had heavily implied that they were dipping into their retirement savings to keep the lights on. The spreadsheet told a different story. Their monthly income from pensions and the rental property was stable. Their living expenses had not spiked. In fact, their savings account balance was healthy. It sat at just over $140,000. That was not a fortune, but it was certainly not poverty. They were not living paycheck to paycheck. They had a cushion. So why the panic? Why the aggressive demand for $600,000 from the sale of my home? I dug deeper. I looked at the withdrawals. Standard utility bills, groceries, a country club membership fee, which was interesting for people claiming financial ruin. And then I saw it. Beginning 8 months ago, a new pattern emerged. On the 15th of every month, there was a wire transfer. The first one was for $5,000. The next month, it was $7,500. Then it jumped to $12,000. The recipient was not a law firm. It was not a medical provider. It was listed simply as Project OC, LLC. I highlighted the cells. I summed the total over the last 8 months. My parents had transferred nearly $85,000 to this entity. I felt the adrenaline kick in. This was the hunt. This was the moment the random noise coalesced into a signal. I opened a new tab and searched for the business registry. I needed to know who or what Project OC, LLC was. If this was for Megan's divorce, the money should be going to a recognized family law practice. Lawyers love branding. They do not hide behind vague shell company names unless they are doing something they do not want on their letterhead. The search results came back. Project OC, LLC was registered in Delaware, a state known for corporate anonymity. It had been incorporated exactly 9 months ago. The registered agent was a generic corporate service company. There was no website, no phone number, no listed partners. It was a black box. But the timing was critical. The payment started 1 month after the company was formed, and coincidentally, that was around the time Megan had allegedly separated from her husband. I went back to the bank statements. I cross-referenced the dates of the transfers with my parents' email archives. I searched for Project OC. Nothing. I searched for the dollar amounts. Bingo. I found an email thread between my father and my mother. It was dated 8 months ago. The subject line was blank. The body of the email was short. The first installment is due. I am moving the funds today. We have to keep this contained. Elaine, if this gets out, it is over. My mother's reply was even shorter. Just pay it. Whatever they ask. We cannot let people know. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. This was not a divorce legal fee. You do not talk about legal fees like they are blackmail payments. You do not say if this gets out, it is over about a standard separation. The crisis my father had spoken of was real, but it was not what they had told me. They were bleeding cash, yes, but they were not bleeding because of a vindictive ex-husband. They were paying someone to keep a secret. I looked at the pattern of the payments again. The amounts were escalating. $5,000, $12,000. The most recent one, sent just 2 weeks ago, was for $20,000. This was why they needed my apartment. They were not trying to build a war chest for a legal battle. They were running out of cash to feed a beast that was getting hungrier every month. The $85,000 they had already spent was a significant chunk of their liquidity. If the payments continued to rise at this rate, they would burn through their remaining savings in less than 6 months. My $600,000 would buy them a lot of silence. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. What had Megan done? Or worse, what had my parents done that was worth sacrificing their relationship with their eldest daughter to hide? I needed more than just a suspicious LLC name. I needed to know who was behind it. I went back to the email archive. I expanded my search parameters. If they were not using the name Project OC in their emails, they might be communicating with a person associated with it. I looked for external email addresses that appeared around the same time the LLC was formed. I filtered out the noise, newsletters, spam, family chatter. I focused on a 2-week window 9 months ago. I found an exchange with an address ending in a generic Gmail domain. The sender's display name was just initials, K-V. The email from K-V was formal but threatening in its brevity. The situation regarding the incident on the 4th needs to be formalized. Attached is the structure for the arrangement. We advise immediate compliance to avoid public disclosure. Attached to that email was a PDF. I clicked on it. It was a consulting agreement, but the scope of work was nonsense. It used buzzwords like reputation management and strategic narrative control. It was a contract for silence, and the signatory on behalf of the LLC was not KV. It was a scrawl that looked indecipherable. But the date of the incident mentioned, the 4th of the month, triggered a memory. That was the weekend Megan had supposedly gone on a retreat to find herself before the marriage problems became public. My parents had told me she was at a spa in Arizona. I checked the credit card statements for that month. There were no charges in Arizona. There were, however, charges for a rental car in a town 3 hours north of here, and a charge for a motel that was definitely not a spa. I started to piece the timeline together. Megan goes missing for a weekend. A week later, a mysterious LLC is formed. A month later, my parents start paying thousands of dollars to that LLC. Now, the payments are skyrocketing, and they are suing me to keep the cash flow going. The divorce was a lie, or at least, it was a convenient distraction. Megan's husband wasn't the villain. He might not even be involved. He might be the one they were hiding the truth from. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My eyes were burning, but my mind was razor sharp. I had gone into this thinking I was fighting a greedy family. Now I realized I was investigating a cover-up. I created a new folder on my encrypted drive. I did not name it family. I did not name it lawsuit. I typed in the name, evidence. I dragged the bank statements, the LLC registry info, the email thread with KV, and the consulting agreement into the folder. I had the what. They were paying hush money. I had the when. It started 9 months ago. I had the how. A shell company and a fake lawsuit to steal my assets. Now I just needed the why. What exactly happened on the 4th? And who was KV? I closed the browser and ejected the hard drive. I held the small metal device in my hand. It was cold. Inside this drive was enough ammunition to blow their lawsuit out of the water, but if I used it now, if I just showed them I knew about the money, they might panic. They might destroy the deeper evidence I still needed to find. I needed to draw them out. I needed them to think I was still looking at the surface, debating the morality of selling my home, while I quietly dismantled their secret from the inside. I stood up and walked to the window. The city below was asleep, a grid of dark streets and scattered lights. My parents were probably sleeping soundly in their suburban home, confident that their pressure campaign was working. They thought they had trapped me. They had no idea that I had just walked through the walls of their fortress and stolen the blueprints. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hand was steady. The fear I had felt yesterday morning was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a risk analyst who has just identified the root cause of a systematic failure. Tomorrow, I would make a phone call, not to my parents, but to a contact I had in corporate forensics. I was going to find out who owned Project OC, LLC, even if I had to peel back every layer of shell company varnish to do it. The game had changed. They were playing for money. I was playing for the truth. The search for the true ownership of Project OC, LLC, took less than 2 hours. My parents had made a fundamental mistake common among amateurs trying to hide assets. They assumed that a generic name and a Delaware registration were an impenetrable shield. They forgot that in the age of digital footprints, privacy is a commodity that costs much more than they were willing to pay. I used a proprietary database that Harborline subscribes to, a tool we use to vet potential corporate partners for money laundering risks. I input the tax identification number I had scraped from the metadata of the consulting agreement. The system churned for a moment, cross-referencing state filings with banking Know Your Customer data. When the result popped up on my center monitor, I didn't gasp. I didn't blink. I just stared at the screen, letting the cold reality settle in. The registered agent was indeed a shell service, but the managing member, the person with the legal authority to sign checks and bind the company, was listed clearly: Megan Anderson. My sister was not just the beneficiary of this crisis. She was the architect of the financial vehicle consuming my parents' savings. I leaned back, steepling my fingers. This changed the narrative completely. If this were a simple divorce case where my parents were helping a helpless daughter, they would pay her divorce lawyer directly. They would pay her landlord directly. Instead, they were funneling cash into a company controlled by Megan, which was then paying out to third-party consultants. This was money laundering. It was domestic, low-level, and clumsy, but it was money laundering nonetheless. They were washing the family savings through a clean entity to hide the final destination of the funds. I went back to the spreadsheet. Now that I knew Megan was the endpoint, I expanded my analysis of the family's historical cash flow. I stopped looking at just the last 8 months and pulled the data for the last 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable. It was a slow bleed that had recently turned into a hemorrhage. 4 years ago, there was a transfer of $8,000 categorized as car loan help. 3 years ago, $15,000 for medical expenses, though I recalled Megan had excellent health insurance at the time. 2 years ago, a lump sum of $25,000 sent to a landlord to cover broken lease fees. My parents had been subsidizing Megan's existence for her entire adult life, but the recent activity was different. The payments to Project OC, LLC, were not for rent or cars. I drilled down into the vendor list attached to the LLC's expenses in the archived files. One vendor appeared repeatedly: Sentinel Image Solutions. I opened a new browser tab and searched for the company. Their website was sleek, dark, and minimalist. They did not sell legal services. They did not offer family counseling. Their tagline read, "Erasure, Suppression, Narrative Control." They were a crisis management firm, a high-end fixer service for people who had done something terrible and needed the internet to forget about it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My parents were not paying for a divorce lawyer. They were paying a cleanup crew. I went back to the email archive, searching specifically for correspondence involving Sentinel Image Solutions. I found a thread from 2 months ago, forwarded from Megan to my father. It was an invoice for $10,000, but it was the attachment that stopped my heart. It was a document titled Contingency Media Plan B. I opened it. It was a script, a literal script, written for my parents and Megan to memorize in case the primary containment strategy fails. QO. Rumors suggest there was an altercation at the property. How do you respond? A. It was a private family dispute that has been amicably resolved. Any suggestion of criminal conduct is baseless and defamatory. Q. Why did Megan leave the state so suddenly? A. She needed time to focus on her mental health during a difficult separation. I read the document 3 times. Altercation, criminal conduct, sudden departure. The divorce was not the crisis. The divorce was the cover story. Megan had done something that involved the police, or at least the threat of them, and my parents were burning through their life savings to bury it before it destroyed the family name. And now that they were running out of dirt to shovel, they needed my house to buy more time. The lawsuit against me was not about filial duty. It was a desperate grab for cash to pay the blackmailers and the fixers. They were racing against a clock I couldn't see. I needed backup. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not used in a year. Laura Bennett answered on the second ring. Laura was not a family lawyer. She was a corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers and contract disputes. She was expensive, ruthless, and devoid of sentimentality. In short, she was exactly who I needed. Sophie, she said. Her voice was crisp. I assume this isn't a social call. I need you to look at a filing. I said, I just emailed it to you. I heard the clicking of her mouse. There was a silence on the line for about 2 minutes. I waited. I knew she was scanning the document, absorbing the legal threats and the aggressive demands. Interesting, Laura said finally. Who represents the plaintiffs? A firm called Miller and Haynes, I said. Mall strip lawyers. She scoffed. Ambulance chasers. This filing is a mess. Sophie, the premise of implied contract of support is legally laughable in New York regarding adult children. Unless you signed a contract promising to support them, they have no standing. I know, I said, but they are threatening an emergency injunction to freeze my assets. They are threatening to allege elder abuse to my employer. That is the real play, Laura said. Her tone shifted, becoming sharper. They know they can't win on the merits. This is a shakedown. They are banking on the fact that you, being a risk analyst with a reputation to protect, will cut a check to make the noise stop. They are leveraging your fear of embarrassment. They want the house, I said. They want me to sell it immediately. Because they need liquidity now, Laura concluded. If they were willing to wait for a trial, they wouldn't have filed such a sloppy initial complaint. They are trying to shock you into a settlement. If you fight this, it drags on for 18 months. They don't have 18 months. No, I agreed. They barely have 18 days. I told her about Project OC, LLC. I told her about the payments to the crisis management firm and the media scripts. I did not tell her the specifics of what I suspected Megan had done, mostly because I didn't know yet, but also because I needed Laura focused on the defense, not the crime. Laura let out a low whistle. So, your parents aren't just greedy, they are compromised. This lawsuit is an act of desperation. What are my options? I asked. We have 2 paths, Laura said. Path 1. We file a motion to dismiss. It is clean. It is standard. We argue lack of standing. The judge will likely grant it. But it will take 3 to 6 months to get on the docket. In that time, your parents can continue to harass you, leak stories to the press, and file amended complaints. And path 2? Path 2 is the nuclear option. Laura said, we don't just defend, we countersue. We file for a declaratory judgment that you owe them nothing. We subpoena their financial records to prove that their claim of destitution is fraudulent. We depose them. We put them under oath and ask them, on the record, where their money is going. If we do that, I said, realizing the implication, they will have to perjure themselves to hide Megan's secret, or they will have to drop the lawsuit to avoid exposing her. Exactly, Laura said. It is a game of chicken. They are driving a car straight at you, betting you will swerve because you are a good daughter. If you stay in your lane and accelerate, they have to crash or turn. I looked at the screen, at the script my parents had memorized to lie to the world. They had already crashed. They just wanted to drag me into the wreckage with them. Draft the counterclaim, I said. Are you sure? Laura asked. Once we serve this, there is no going back to Sunday dinners. There haven't been Sunday dinners for a long time. Laura, just business meetings where I am the meal. I heard the smile in her voice. I will have the papers ready by tomorrow afternoon. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to informal chats, if they call. Tell them to speak to your attorney. I hung up the phone. The sun was beginning to rise over the city. The sky was a bruised purple, turning to gray. I felt a strange sense of calm. For the last 24 hours, I had been reacting. I had been the victim of a surprise attack. Now, I was on the offensive. My parents were operating under the assumption that I was afraid of them. They thought I was afraid of losing my house, afraid of losing my job, afraid of losing their love. They were wrong. I wasn't afraid. I was insulted. I opened the folder labeled Evidence again. I looked at the media plan. Contingency Plan B. They were so worried about the story leaking to the press. They were terrified of the public finding out about the incident. They were spending thousands of dollars a month to buy silence. The irony was bitter. They were suing me to get the money to buy silence. But by suing me, they had forced me to find the very secret they were trying to hide. I closed my laptop. I needed to shower. I needed to go to work. I needed to walk into my office at Harborline Advisory, sit at my desk, and perform my duties with absolute perfection. Because when the subpoena hit my parents' doorstep, I wanted to be watching the fallout from a position of unassailable strength. They wanted a war over assets? Fine, but they had forgotten the first rule of asset management. Never leverage something you cannot afford to lose. They had leveraged their relationship with me, and the margin call was coming. The silence in my office at Harborline Advisory was usually my sanctuary, but today it felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I had spent the morning analyzing market volatility for a logistics client, but my mind kept drifting back to the data I had pulled from my parents' digital lives. I had the financial motive, I had the cover-up, but a nagging instinct, the same one that made me excellent at my job, told me I was still missing a piece of the puzzle. In risk analysis, we look for bleed. Bleed is when a problem in one sector infects another. My parents' financial desperation was the infection. I needed to know if it had already bled into my property rights in ways I hadn't yet detected. I logged into the county clerk's online portal. It is a public database, but few people bother to check their own property records unless they are buying or selling. I typed in my address. I navigated to the title history section. I expected to see only the original deed from when I purchased the apartment and the mortgage lien from my bank. Instead, I saw an inquiry flag dated 6 months ago. It was not a lien, but it was a notice of pendency of action that had been filed and then immediately withdrawn 2 days later. The filing entity was a company called Equity Swift Capital. I frowned. I had never heard of them. I had never applied for a loan with them. I quickly searched for the company. They were a hard money lender, the kind that offers high-interest loans against property equity with minimal questions asked. They were the predatory sharks of the real estate world. Why would a hard money lender be looking at my title 6 months ago? I switched back to the encrypted hard drive containing my parents' data. I had searched for Project OC and Sentinel, but I hadn't searched for Equity Swift. I typed the name into the search bar of the archive. 3 emails appeared. The first was from my father to an agent named Marcus at Equity Swift Capital. The subject line was, "Collateral verification." I opened the email, and the temperature in my office seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus. The email read, "Attached is the preliminary authorization regarding the property on West 4th Street. My daughter is currently overseas for work, but as discussed, I have full power of attorney to manage her assets during this period. We need the liquidity by the 1st of the month." I froze. Overseas for work? 6 months ago, I was in Chicago for a conference for 3 days. I was not overseas, and I had never, ever given my father power of attorney. I clicked on the attachment. It was a PDF file named S. Anderson POA Executed, PDF. I opened it. On the screen was a standard New York State power of attorney form. It granted Richard Anderson unlimited authority to conduct real estate transactions, banking transactions, an asset liquidation on behalf of Sophie Anderson. And at the bottom of the page, above the signature line, was my name. And a signature. I stared at it. It was a loop-for-loop imitation of my signature. To a stranger, it would look authentic. But I knew my hand. I knew the way I crossed my T's with a sharp, upward flick. I knew the way I rushed the E at the end of my first name. This signature was too perfect. It was careful. The pressure was even throughout the ink strokes, suggesting it had been drawn slowly, not signed with the fluid muscle memory of a person writing their own name. It was a forgery. I felt a wave of nausea, followed immediately by a cold, hard rage. This wasn't just a toxic family dynamic. This wasn't just emotional manipulation. My father had sat down, printed a legal document, forged my signature, and attempted to mortgage my home behind my back. I opened the next email in the chain. It was a reply from Marcus at the lending company. Mr. Anderson, the document appears to be a photocopy. For a loan of this size, $400,000, we require the original notarized document with the raised seal, or for Ms. Anderson to appear via video conference to confirm the authorization. The final email from my father was short and defeatist. She is unreachable in a remote location. We will have to pause the application. I sat back in my chair, my hands shaking. They had tried to rob me. That was the only way to describe it. They had tried to secretly leverage $400,000 of equity out of my home. If the lender hadn't been diligent about the notary seal, I would have woken up one day with a massive lien on my property or, worse, faced foreclosure when they inevitably defaulted on the payments. The lawsuit. The lawsuit was Plan B. They didn't sue me because I refused to help. They sued me because they failed to steal. I grabbed my phone and dialed Laura. I need you to clear your schedule for 30 minutes. I said. I did not say hello. Sophie, I am in a deposition. She started. I found a forged power of attorney. I cut her off. My father tried to take out a hard money loan on my apartment 6 months ago. He sent a document with my faked signature to a lender. I have the email. I have the PDF. The line went silent. I could hear Laura breathing. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all its professional detachment. It was low and deadly serious. Send it to me, now. I encrypted the file and emailed it to her secure server. I waited. 2 minutes later, my phone rang. This changes the venue. Sophie, Laura said, this is no longer a civil dispute about familial support. This is attempted grand larceny. This is second-degree forgery. This is wire fraud. She paused, and I could hear her pacing. If we introduce this into the record, your father could go to prison, not for a weekend, for years. I looked at the signature on the screen. I thought about the text messages my mother had sent me that week. We just want what is best for the family. Why are you being so difficult? They had smiled at me across the dinner table, knowing they had this document on a hard drive. They had hugged me, knowing they had tried to sign away my financial future to a predatory lender. They were willing to destroy me to save Megan. That was the hierarchy. Megan was the priority. I was the collateral. I want to file the counterclaim, I said, and I want to include this as Exhibit A. Sophie, Laura warned, once we allege criminal fraud, the judge is obligated to refer it to the district attorney. You lose control of the outcome. You cannot just use this as leverage to make them settle and then bury it. Once it is out, it is out. I know, I said. Are you prepared to be the daughter who put her father in jail? I looked out the window at the skyline of the city I had conquered on my own. I thought about the 10 years of savings. I thought about the late nights. And I thought about the absolute lack of hesitation my father must have felt when he put that pen to the paper to fake my name. He did not act like a father. I said. He acted like a thief. I took a breath. File it, Laura. I want a full forensic accounting of their finances. I want a deposition, and I want them to see this document attached to the complaint. I want them to know that I know. Okay, Laura said. The gloves are off. I will draft the motion for summary judgment based on unclean hands and fraud. We will ask for a dismissal of their suit and damages for legal fees and emotional distress. No, I said, I don't just want a dismissal. I want a restraining order. I want legal protection that ensures they can never, ever touch a single asset of mine again. We can get that, Laura said. With this evidence, we can get everything. I hung up the phone. The nausea was gone. In its place was a heavy, dark realization. The family I thought I was fighting, the misguided, desperate, overbearing parents, did not exist. They were a fiction. The reality was a group of people who viewed me as an object, a resource. I looked at the date on the forged document again. It was signed on my birthday. I remembered that birthday. They had called me. They had sung happy birthday over the speakerphone. My mother had told me she was so proud of the independent woman I had become. And all the while, the ink on my forged signature was drying on my father's desk. I closed the file. I did not cry. Crying implies a loss of something valuable. I hadn't lost a father. I had lost an illusion. And losing an illusion, while painful, is necessary for survival. I opened my calendar. I had a meeting with the senior vice president in an hour. I would go to that meeting. I would smile. I would present my risk assessment for the quarter. And while I did that, Laura would be preparing the document that would detonate my family. I was done being the victim. It was time to show them what happens when you try to liquidate a risk analyst. You don't get the cash, you get the audit, and the audit was going to be terminal. The coincidence is a concept I do not believe in. In my world, everything is a result of intersecting variables. So, when I ran into Chloe Miller at a coffee shop on 3rd Avenue, I did not view it as fate. I viewed it as an opportunity to harvest data from an unsecured source. Chloe had been Megan's maid of honor. She was the kind of woman who treated information like currency, spending it freely to buy temporary relevance in a conversation. We had not spoken in 2 years. Not since I politely declined to attend Megan's gender reveal party for a pregnancy that turned out to be a false alarm. "Sophie," she squealed, nearly spilling her oat milk latte. "Oh my God, I haven't seen you in forever. You look so corporate." "Hello." "Chloe," I said, keeping my expression pleasant but guarded. I checked my watch intentionally. I have 5 minutes before a meeting. She fell into step beside me as I walked toward my office building. I thought she would ask about my job or my life, but Chloe had a one-track mind. "I was so sorry to hear about Megan," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is just awful. I mean, I know she can be a handful, but nobody deserves that kind of stress." I stopped walking. My analyst brain flagged the ambiguity. Was she talking about the divorce or something else? "It has been a difficult time," I said vaguely. "We are just trying to navigate the legal side of things now." Chloe nodded vigorously. "I bet. My cousin got a DUI last year, and the legal fees were insane. But at least he didn't flee the scene. I mean, that is the part that makes it so much worse for Megan, right? The leaving?" The air in my lungs turned to ice. "Fleeing the scene?" I kept my face perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not ask, "What are you talking about?" If I showed ignorance, Chloe would clam up. She wanted to gossip with an insider, not explain things to an outsider. "It is a complication," I agreed smoothly, "but we are hoping the settlement will keep it quiet." Chloe sighed. "Yeah, well, money talks. I told her she was lucky the guy she hit was willing to negotiate. If that video had stayed on Instagram for more than an hour, she would be totally canceled. Thank God your parents hired those scrubber guys. What are they called? Sentinel?" "Sentinel," I repeated. "Yes, they are very effective." "I mean, I saw the clip before it got wiped." Chloe continued, unaware she was handing me the smoking gun. She was clearly wasted. "Sophie, putting the rental car into the side of that restaurant patio, and then just reversing and driving off with the bumper dragging? It is a miracle nobody died." My mind was racing, connecting the dots at lightning speed. The rental car charge 3 hours north. The consulting fees to Project O, C, LLC, the payments to Sentinel Image Solutions, the script about an altercation. Megan hadn't gone to a spa. She had gone on a bender. She had crashed a car into a business, likely while intoxicated, and fled the scene. That was a felony. If she had been caught and charged, She would be facing prison time. But she wasn't charged, because my parents had intervened. So the divorce is really taking a toll on her, Chloe added, pivoting back to the approved narrative. I mean, her husband was furious about the settlement money coming out of their joint savings initially. That is why he left, right? Right, I said. That is exactly why. I checked my watch again. I really have to run. Chloe, good to see you. I walked away before she could say another word. I didn't head to my office. I went into a quiet alleyway between two skyscrapers and pulled out my phone. I opened the encrypted drive on my phone. I pulled up the bank statements. The date of the incident in the Sentinel email was the 4th of May. I checked the weather reports for the town where the rental car was charged. It had rained that night. Slippery roads. I checked the local news archives for that town on that date. There it was, a small article in the local police blotter. Vehicle strikes patio of the OC, bar and grill. Driver fled scene. Police investigating. Project OC, LLC. It wasn't a random name. It was the name of the victim. My parents had formed a shell company named after the bar Megan had destroyed to pay off the owner. The $85,000 wasn't for legal defense. It was restitution. They were paying the owner of the bar to not file a police report. They were paying for the structural damage and, likely, for the silence of any witnesses. And the divorce? It was a convenient tragedy. A husband leaving his wife because she is a drunk driver who drained their savings to pay off a felony is a shameful story. A husband leaving his wife because he is controlling and she is a victim is a story that garners sympathy. It is a story that makes people, like a wealthy older sister, feel obligated to help. They were not just covering up a crime. They were monetizing my sympathy to pay for it. I dialed Laura. I know what Project OC stands for, I said when she answered. Tell me, Laura replied. It stands for the OC Bar and Grill. I said, Megan drove a rental car into it while drunk and fled the scene 6 months ago. The payments are hush money to the business owner to prevent criminal charges. The divorce is real. But it happened because her husband refused to be part of the cover-up. My parents are using the abandoned wife narrative to guilt me into selling my house to pay the blackmail. There was a long silence on the line. Jesus, Laura whispered, that is obstruction of justice. If they are paying a witness to withhold evidence of a felony, that is a crime in itself. Sophie. And they forged my signature to get a loan to pay for it. I added, they were going to use my home equity to pay off the owner of a bar, so their precious reputation wouldn't be tarnished by a mugshot. We have enough, Laura said. Her voice was steel. I am drafting the motion to dismiss the lawsuit with prejudice. I am also filing for an order of protection for your assets. We are going to attach the police blotter report and the forensic accounting of the payments to Project OC, LLC. No, I said. Laura paused. No? Not yet, I said. If we file now, they might run. They might try to liquidate something else. Or they might try to approach the bar owner and destroy the records of the agreement. What do you want to do? Let the hearing date stand, I said. Let them come to the table. Let them think I am scared. Let them think their pressure campaign is working. I want them in the room. Laura, I want them on the record denying everything before we drop the hammer. Sophie, this is risky. If we wait, they might escalate. Let them escalate, I said coldly. The more they push, the more evidence they generate. I am not selling the house. I am not answering their calls. Let them sit in their silence and worry. I hung up. I stood in the alleyway, watching the steam rise from a vent in the ground. I felt a strange sense of detachment. The sister I had grown up with, the girl I had protected from bullies on the playground, was gone. In her place was a liability, a person who would drive drunk, endanger lives, run away, and then let her parents cannibalize her sister's life to cover it up. And my parents, they had made their choice. They chose the image of the perfect family over the reality of their children's character. They would rather commit fraud against their competent daughter than hold their incompetent daughter accountable. I walked back out onto the street. The city moved around me. loud and chaotic. I checked my email. There was a new message from my father. "Sophie, we haven't heard from you. The court date is approaching. Please, don't make us do this. Just sign the agreement and we can put this behind us. We love you." I stared at the words, "We love you." It was the most expensive lie they had ever told. I did not reply. I deleted the email. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. We were going to court, and I was going to ensure that when we left, the only thing they would be holding was the truth they had tried so hard to bury. The trap was set. All they had to do was walk in. The art of negotiation is not about speaking. It is about knowing exactly when to stop. It is about leaving a silence so loud that the other party rushes to fill it with their own mistakes. I sat at my kitchen island, a fresh pot of coffee brewing, and opened my laptop. It was Wednesday evening. The court date for the initial hearing regarding the injunction was set for Monday. My parents had spent the last 3 days peppering me with alternating currents of guilt and threats. They had left voicemails sounding like weeping victims and sent texts sounding like debt collectors. They were tired. I could hear it in their voices. Fatigue makes people sloppy. Fatigue makes people desperate for a quick win. I decided to give them the illusion of one. I opened a new email draft. I did not address it to Mom and Dad. I addressed it simply to Richard and Elaine. "I am exhausted." I typed, "I have been looking at my finances, and I do not see a way out of this without selling the apartment. If the situation with Megan is truly as critical as you say, I am willing to consider your proposal. However, I cannot liquidate an asset of this magnitude blindly. If you want me to sign the listing agreement, I need to see the outstanding invoices for the divorce proceedings. I need to know exactly where the money is going so I can explain it to my accountant." I read it over. It was the perfect bait. It validated their narrative. That the money was for a divorce. It offered them precisely what they wanted, the sale of my home, and it gave them a legitimate reason to send me documents. I hit send. I expected a delay. I expected them to consult with their lawyer, or perhaps to forge some new documents, but I had underestimated their panic. They saw the words "willing to consider" and they lunged. 9 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was an email from my mother. The subject line was, "Expenses, urgent." "Oh, Sophie, thank God." The body of the email read, "We knew you would come through. We knew you wouldn't let your sister down. Attached are the current obligations. Please, we need to move on this by Friday." There were 3 attachments. I downloaded them, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. The first document was a legitimate-looking invoice from a family law attorney. It was for $5,000. It was for initial consultation and filing. Standard stuff. If I hadn't known better, I would have stopped there. The second document was a spreadsheet titled Megan Monthly Budget, XLS. It listed rent, therapy, and support. It looked inflated, but not criminal. Then I opened the third document. It was a PDF file with a generic name, scan00459.pdf. My mother, in her haste, had likely scanned a stack of papers from her desk without checking every single page. Or perhaps she was so used to viewing these expenses as necessary that she had forgotten they were incriminating. The first page of the PDF was a bill for a luxury rental car. The second page was a credit card statement showing the charge to the hotel 3 hours north. The third page was the smoking gun. It was a contract, not a divorce settlement, not a lease. It was a non-disclosure and settlement agreement. The parties listed were Project OC, LLC, representing the interests of Megan Anderson, and the ORC Bar and Grill, LLC. I zoomed in on the terms. In exchange for the sum of $120,000 to be paid in monthly installments, the claimant agrees to waive all civil claims regarding the property damage sustained on May 4th. Furthermore, the claimant agrees to decline prosecution and withdraw any statements provided to law enforcement regarding the identity of the driver involved in the incident. There was a clause at the bottom, bolded and underlined. Breach of this confidentiality provision will result in the immediate resumption of criminal pursuit. I sat back. My mother had just emailed me proof of obstruction of justice. She had sent me the blackmail contract she was trying to force me to pay for. They were literally buying the silence of a victim to keep Megan out of handcuffs, and the price tag was $120,000. That explained the cash drain. That explained the panic. If they missed a payment, the bar owner calls the cops, and Megan goes to jail for felony hit and run. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from my father. "We are so proud of you. Sophie, you are doing the right thing. The family will remember this. We will make it up to you once the dust settles." I stared at the screen. The family will remember this. Yes, Richard, we certainly will. I forwarded the email, the attachments, and the text message to Laura. I added a simple note. They just handed us the keys. Laura called me 10 minutes later. She didn't even say hello. "This is incredible," she said. Her voice was filled with the professional glee of a litigator who has just been handed a winning lottery ticket. They didn't just expose the lie. They documented the extortion. "Sophie, this agreement is barely legal. It is essentially a contract to suppress evidence of a crime. If a judge sees this, your parents aren't just losing the lawsuit. They are looking at aiding and abetting." "What is the next move?" I asked. "I am canceling the motion to dismiss," Laura said. "Why?" "Because a dismissal just ends the fight," she explained. "I want to finish it. We are going to convert the hearing on Monday into a settlement conference. We will tell them you are ready to sign, but you want to do it in person, with counsel present, to finalize the details." "You want to lure them in," I said. "I want them in a room, under oath, or at least on the record," Laura said. "I want them to demand the money, and then I want to slide this document across the table and watch their faces." It was a trap, a legal, ethical, and devastating trap. "Do it," I said. The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. I did not go to work on Thursday or Friday. I took personal days. I treated this hearing like the most important presentation of my career. I printed out the timeline I had constructed. May 4th, the accident. May 10th, the creation of the shell company. June 1st, the forged power of attorney attempt. August through October, the payments to the bar and the crisis PR firm. This week, the lawsuit against me. I organized the evidence into a binder. Tab A, the financials. Tab B, the forgery. Tab C, the cover-up. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I wore my charcoal gray suit, the one I wore when I had to fire people or deliver bad news to shareholders. I practiced my face. My mother would cry. That was a guarantee. She would weep about how hard it is to be a parent, about how I didn't understand the lengths you go to for your children. She would try to weaponize her tears to make me feel like a monster. My father would bluster. He would talk about duty and loyalty and how I was betraying the bloodline. Megan would play the victim. She would look small and fragile, the broken bird that needed the entire forest to burn down just to keep her warm. I could not react to any of it. If I showed anger, they would say I was vindictive. If I showed sadness, they would think I was wavering. I had to be a mirror, cold, hard, and reflecting their own ugliness back at them. I looked at myself in the mirror. You are not their daughter. I told my reflection, not in that room. In that room, you are the defendant, and you are the prosecution. Saturday passed in slow motion. Sunday was even slower. I received 3 more emails from my mother, thanking me for being reasonable and asking if I had contacted a realtor yet. I didn't reply. I let them marinate in their own relief. They thought they had won. They thought the check was as good as written. On Monday morning, the city was gray and drizzling. It was fitting weather for an execution. I met Laura in the lobby of the office building where the mediation was to take place. It was neutral ground, a conference center near the courthouse. Laura looked impeccable in a cream-colored suit. She was holding a thick file folder. "Ready?" she asked. I adjusted the cuff of my blouse. I realized my hands weren't shaking. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely steady. "Let's go," I said. We took the elevator to the 20th floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime. The receptionist directed us to conference room B. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my heels on the marble floor echoing like a metronome. I thought about the little girl who used to wait by the window for her father to come home from work. I thought about the teenager who worked double shifts to pay for her own textbooks because her parents said they were tight this month, the same month they bought Megan a new car. I wasn't doing this for revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is messy. I was doing this for clarity. I was doing this to correct the record. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped inside. They were already there. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking smug. He was wearing his best suit, a tie that was a little too bright. Elaine was next to him, clutching a tissue, her eyes already watery with anticipated gratitude. Megan sat in the corner, scrolling on her phone, looking bored, as if this meeting about her survival was just another inconvenience she had to endure. Their lawyer, a man named Miller who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, stood up to shake my hand. "Sophie," Richard boomed, a wide, fake smile plastering his face. "So glad we could do this civilly. Come, sit. We have the papers ready for the transfer." He gestured to a stack of documents in front of him. The deed transfer. The agreement to sell. I did not smile. I did not sit where he pointed. I walked to the opposite side of the table. I pulled out my chair slowly and sat down. Laura sat next to me. She placed the thick file folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was heavy. Solid. Miller looked at the folder, then at Laura. "I thought we were here to sign the settlement?" "We are here to settle the matter," Laura said, her voice pleasant but sharp as a razor. "But not the way you think." Elaine looked confused. "Sophie? You said you were willing to help. You said in the email." "I said I would consider it if I saw the invoices. I said—" My voice was calm. It didn't sound like my voice. It sounded like the voice of the risk analyst. "And you sent them. Thank you for that. Mother." Richard frowned. "So what is the problem? The numbers are there. Megan needs the help. We are a family. Just sign the damn paper. Sophie, and let's go get lunch." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had forged my name. "I am not signing anything." "Richard," I said. The room went deadly quiet. "Then why are we here?" he snapped, his face turning red. "Because," I said, reaching for the binder Laura had prepared, "I am here to give you a choice." I opened the binder. I took out the first document, the police blotter report. I slid it across the table. Then the second document, the forensic accounting of the payments to Project OC, LLC. I slid that one too. And finally, I took out the non-disclosure agreement my mother had emailed me by mistake. I slid it directly to Megan. She looked down. Her face went pale. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table. "What is this?" Richard whispered. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at me. And for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "That," I said, pointing to the paper in front of Megan, "is the reason I'm not selling my house. I am not selling my assets to pay for a felony cover-up." I leaned forward. "And I am certainly not selling my house to people who forged my signature to try and steal it from me 6 months ago." Laura reached into her file and pulled out the forged power of attorney. She placed it in front of their lawyer. "Mr. Miller," she said coolly, "I assume your clients didn't inform you that they attempted to mortgage my client's home with a fraudulent instrument before retaining your services?" Miller looked at the document. He looked at the signature. Then he looked at Richard with an expression of pure horror. He closed his own file. He knew, in that second, that he had walked into a massacre. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Richard was opening and closing his mouth like a fish. Elaine let out a gasp that sounded like a choke. The trap had snapped shut, and I hadn't shed a single tear. The conference room smelled of lemon polish and stale anxiety, while the documents I had slid across the table in the final moments of our greeting still sat there, heavy and accusing. The mediator, a retired judge named Mr. Sterling, had not yet reviewed them. He called the room to order, oblivious to the fact that the verdict had arguably already been delivered. We were seated in a formation that felt less like a negotiation and more like a theatrical performance. On one side, my parents, Richard and Elaine, were huddled together, presenting a united front of weary, opal suffering. My mother had positioned a box of tissues prominently in front of her. My father sat with his shoulders hunched, mimicking the posture of a man carrying the weight of the world, rather than a man who had tried to mortgage his daughter's home behind her back. Megan sat slightly behind them, detached from the tableau. She was dressed in black, a mourning outfit for a marriage that was not actually dead, but her attention was entirely consumed by the blue light of her smartphone. Her thumbs moved in a rapid, rhythmic blur, likely deleting social media posts or texting the friends she had partied with on the night of the crash. "Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "We are here to resolve the matter of Anderson versus Anderson. The goal is to reach an equitable agreement regarding the petition for familial support and the disposition of the property on West 4th Street. Mr. Miller, you may begin." Mr. Miller, my parents' attorney, stood up. He was a man who clearly preferred the volume of his voice to the strength of his arguments. He adjusted his tie and looked at me with a practiced expression of disappointment. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice booming, "this case is not merely about assets. It is about the fundamental fabric of the family unit. We have here two devoted parents, Richard and Elaine, who have given everything, their youth, their savings, their energy, to raise two daughters. One daughter, Megan, has fallen on tragic times through no fault of her own. She is facing a devastating divorce and financial ruin." He paused for effect, gesturing to my mother, who dabbed at a dry eye with a tissue. "And then we have the respondent, Sophie," he continued, pointing a finger at me, "a daughter who has flourished, a daughter who sits on a property worth nearly $1 million, a property secured, in spirit, if not in deed, by the stability her parents provided. Now, when the family faces a crisis, when the wolves are at the door, she turns her back, she cites legal technicalities, she hoards her wealth while her sister faces homelessness. We are asking the court, or this mediation, to recognize the implied contract of support. We are asking for basic human decency." I sat perfectly still. My hands were folded on the table. I did not frown. I did not roll my eyes. I watched Mr. Miller speak with the clinical detachment of a biologist observing a specimen under a microscope. He was good at his job, which was spinning emotional webs, but he was operating on bad data. My father nodded along with the speech, casting sidelong glances at the mediator to see if the emotional hooks were landing. He looked like the picture of righteous indignation. He truly believed he was the victim here. That was the most dangerous thing about Richard Anderson. His capacity for self-deception was infinite. Mr. Sterling turned to my lawyer. "Ms. Bennett, do you have an opening statement?" Laura did not stand up. She didn't need to. She simply leaned forward, her presence dominating the room without raising her voice a single decibel. "We dispute the characterization of the plaintiff's financial situation," Laura said smoothly, "and we dispute the validity of the crisis they claim to be facing. But rather than argue about emotions, we would like to discuss the arithmetic." Laura signaled to me. It was my turn. I opened the binder in front of me. The sound of the metal rings snapping open echoed in the silent room. "Mr. Miller spoke of wolves at the door," I said. My voice was low, steady, and stripped of all inflection. I looked directly at my father. "I would like to identify the wolves." I picked up the spreadsheet I had compiled, the forensic analysis of their bank accounts. I did not slide it this time. I held it up. "According to the sworn financial statement included in your lawsuit, Richard, you claim the family is destitute. You claim that legal fees for Megan's divorce have drained your retirement." I looked at the paper. "But looking at your transaction history for the last 6 months, I see no payments to any family law firm. Not one?" Richard shifted in his seat. "We paid cash," he mumbled, "to keep it discreet." "You withdrew $85,000 in cash?" I asked, in increments that exactly matched the invoices from a shell company called Project OC, LLC. I placed the spreadsheet in the center of the table, facing the mediator. "Mr. Sterling. If you look at line 12 through line 40, you will see a pattern of transfers to this entity. This entity was incorporated 5 days after my sister, Megan, allegedly crashed a rental car into a business 3 hours north of here. Megan's head snapped up from her phone. Her face went slack. Mr. Miller frowned, looking down at his own papers. I am not aware of any car accident. My client stated the funds were for... Your client lied to you. Mr. Miller, I interrupted. I pulled out the police blotter report and placed it next to the spreadsheet. On the 4th of May, a vehicle rented to Megan Anderson struck the patio of the OC Bar and Grill. The driver fled the scene. I looked at Megan. She was no longer checking her phone. She was staring at me with a mixture of terror and hatred. She looked like a child who had been caught stealing from the collection plate. The room was deadly silent. The air conditioning hummed, sounding like a roar in the vacuum. Richard's face had drained of color. The righteous victimhood was gone, replaced by the stark, gray look of exposure. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to deny it, but I didn't give him the chance. The $85,000 wasn't for a divorce lawyer. I continued. It was hush money. You are paying the owner of the bar to suppress evidence of a felony hit and run. And the divorce is a cover story you concocted because Megan's husband refused to be an accessory to a crime. That is slander, Elaine shrieked. Her voice cracked, high and desperate. She slammed her hand on the table. How dare you accuse your sister of that? We are protecting the family name. Something you wouldn't understand. I turned my gaze to my mother. She was trembling, her masquerade of the gentle, sacrificing mother dissolving into the frantic panic of a conspirator. Protecting the family name, I repeated. Is that what you call it? I reached into the binder for the second document, the forged power of attorney. I placed it directly in front of Elaine. Is this also protecting the family name, Mother? Elaine looked down. I watched her eyes track the document. I watched her see the date. I watched her see the signature that tried so hard to be mine but failed in the loops and the pressure points. Mr. Miller leaned in to look at the document. His eyes widened. He adjusted his glasses, leaning closer. What is this? Miller asked, his voice losing its theatrical boom. That, I said, is a power of attorney document dated 6 months ago. It authorizes Richard Anderson to mortgage my apartment for $400,000. It bears a signature that purports to be mine. I paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. But I was not in the country on that date, and I did not sign it. I looked at Richard. You tried to take a hard money loan against my home without my knowledge. You forged my signature to steal my equity because you needed a lump sum to pay off the bar owner, didn't you? And when the lender rejected it because the seal looked fake, you decided to sue me instead. Richard was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. He looked like a cornered animal. It was a misunderstanding. Richard stammered. His voice was a dry rasp. We had verbal permission. You said, years ago, you said you would help if we needed it. I was just expediting the paperwork. Expediting? Laura interjected, her tone incredulous. That is second-degree forgery. Mr. Anderson, that is attempted grand larceny. Mr. Miller pulled back from the table as if the documents were radioactive. He looked at his clients. The weeping mother, the pale father, the petrified sister. He realized, in real time, that he had been hired not to fight a civil suit, but to unwittingly facilitate a fraud ring. I didn't know about this, Miller said, looking at Laura. I want the record to reflect that I had no knowledge of this document or the alleged payments to the LLC. The record reflects it, Laura said coldly, but now you do know. I looked at Megan. She had shrunk into her chair. Megan, I said, do you have the invoices for your divorce lawyer? The ones I asked for in the email? Megan shook her head. No, she whispered, because there is no lawyer. Is there? I asked. She didn't answer. She just started to cry. But these weren't the manipulative tears of my mother. These were the tears of someone who realizes the safety net has been slashed. I turned back to the mediator. Mr. Sterling. He was staring at the pile of evidence with his mouth slightly open. He had probably expected a squabble over who paid for college tuition. Instead, he was looking at a felony flowchart. Mr. Sterling, I said, my parents are not victims. They are extortionists. They filed a frivolous lawsuit to pressure me into liquidating my assets because they are being blackmailed for my sister's criminal negligence, and in the process, they committed financial fraud against me. I stood up. I am not selling my house. I am not paying for Megan's mistakes, and I am not protecting this family anymore. Elaine looked up at me. Her eyes were red, her makeup running. Sophie, please, she begged. If this gets out, if the police find out, Megan will go to jail. I looked at her, and I felt nothing. No guilt, no sorrow, just the cold, clean clarity of the truth. Then perhaps she should have thought about that before she got behind the wheel. I said, Richard slammed his fist on the table. You ungrateful witch, he shouted. After everything we did, we are your parents. You owe us. I leaned over the table, bringing my face close to his. I owed you respect, I said softly, and I paid that debt. But you spent it. You spent it when you signed my name to that loan application. I turned to Laura. We are done here. Laura nodded. She began to pack up the files, but she left copies of the evidence on the table. Mr. Sterling, Laura said, we will be moving for immediate dismissal of the plaintiff's suit, and we will be filing a cross motion for a permanent order of protection. Given the evidence of forgery and fraud, we also reserve the right to refer this matter to the district attorney's office. Mr. Miller looked at Richard. You need to withdraw the suit, he hissed. Right now, before they walk out that door. Richard looked at me. He looked at the evidence. He looked at the ruin of his own making. Sophie, wait, he croaked. I didn't wait. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the door. The sound of my heels on the floor was the only sound in the room. Behind me, I heard Megan sob. A loud, ugly sound. I heard my mother whispering frantically. I heard the mediator shuffling the papers. But I didn't look back. The balance hadn't just tipped. The scale had broken, and I was the only one walking away with my integrity intact. I paused with my hand on the cool brass handle of the conference room door. My father's voice, raspy and desperate, hung in the air like a dying note. He had asked me to wait. He thought there was still something to discuss, some emotional lever he could pull to reset the board. I turned around slowly. I did not walk back to the table. I stood by the door, framing myself as someone who was already gone, someone who was merely looking back at a burning building from a safe distance. You want to talk, Richard? I asked. My voice was devoid of the anger I had felt earlier. It was just hollow. We can fix this, Richard said. Standing up, he wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. We can withdraw the lawsuit. We can find another way to pay the obligation. Just don't leave like this. Don't leave us exposed. Exposed, I repeated. The word tasted metallic. You are worried about exposure. I looked at Laura. She knew exactly what to do. Throughout this entire meeting, we had held back one final piece of evidence. It was not financial. It was not legal. It was psychological. It was the proof that this lawsuit against me was not a panic reaction, but a cold, pre-calculated line item in a business plan. Laura, I said, show them the timeline. Laura reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stapled document we had not yet shared. It was the full email chain from Sentinel Image Solutions, the crisis management firm. She walked over and placed it in the center of the table, directly under the harsh fluorescent light. Mr. Miller, their lawyer, looked at it warily. What is this now? More bank transfers? No, Laura said. This is the script. I took a step forward, addressing the room. You filed the lawsuit against me on the 12th of this month, I stated. But according to this email chain, you were discussing the asset liquidation strategy regarding my apartment with your PR firm 3 months ago. I watched the blood drain from my mother's face. She knew what was in those emails. I continued, my voice cutting through the silence. You didn't sue me because you ran out of money this week. You sued me because the second payment installment to the bar owner is due next Friday. And you calculated, that if you pressured me with a public lawsuit, I would likely settle quickly to avoid the embarrassment, giving you the cash exactly when you needed it. I pointed to the document on the table. Read page 3. Mr. Miller. Miller picked up the document. He squinted at the text. It is an email from Elaine Anderson to the lead consultant. Miller read aloud. His voice wavered. It says, My eldest daughter is risk-averse. If we serve her papers alleging abandonment, she will fold within 48 hours to protect her professional reputation. We can use the proceeds to close the breach of contract with the OC party. The silence that followed was absolute. Megan looked at her mother. You planned to sue her? You told me it was a last resort. You told me you had no choice. Elaine refused to look at Megan. She refused to look at me. She stared at her hands, her fingers twisting a diamond ring that probably cost enough to pay for a month of Megan's rehab. It gets better. I said, read the attachment. Mr. Miller, the document titled Media Contingency. Miller turned the page. He looked ill. It is a draft press release, he said quietly. Read it, I commanded. Miller cleared his throat. Statement from the Anderson family regarding the unfortunate estrangement of our daughter, Sophie Anderson. We are saddened that Sophie has chosen to turn her back on the family during a time of medical crisis. We ask for privacy as we support our younger daughter, Megan, through her treatment for exhaustion. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. Exhaustion, I said. That is the word you chose. Not drunk driving, not a felony hit and run. Exhaustion. And you were ready to smear my name in the press, to call me estranged, to paint me as the villain who abandoned a sick sister, just to control the narrative. I looked at my father. The lawsuit wasn't about money. Richard, it was a PR stunt. You were going to destroy my reputation to save your own. You were willing to let the world think I was a heartless monster so that nobody would look too closely at why Megan was suddenly in treatment. Richard slumped back in his chair. The fight had gone out of him. He looked old, defeated, and small. The arrogance of the patriarch was gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of a man who had bet everything on a bluff and lost. Elaine looked up then. Her eyes were wide, but there was no remorse in them. There was only panic. Sophie, you don't understand, she whispered. Her voice was trembling. If people find out about the crash, the neighbors, the club, we will be pariahs. The Andersons have always been respectable. We have a standing in this community. We couldn't let Megan's mistake ruin 50 years of building a name. I stared at her. That was the twist. That was the sickening reality at the bottom of the well. She wasn't afraid of Megan going to jail. She wasn't afraid of her daughter being hurt. She was afraid of the whispers at the country club. She was afraid of being uninvited to dinner parties. You forged my signature, I said, my voice quiet. You tried to steal my home. You sued me. You planned to ruin my career with a smear campaign. And you did it all not to save your daughter, but to save your social calendar. Elaine flinched as if I had slapped her. Megan made a sound. It was a gasp, a realization hitting her like a physical blow. She looked at her mother with horror. You didn't care about me, Megan whispered. You just cared about the scandal. Elaine turned to her. That is not true. We did it for you. No, Megan said, shaking her head. Tears were streaming down her face now, ruining her makeup. You did it for you. You told me to hide. You told me not to go to the police. You said you would fix it. You made me a criminal to protect your reputation. The family was eating itself alive. The facade of unity had crumbled, revealing the rot underneath. I looked at the mediator. Mr. Sterling. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. He had seen messy divorces, surely, but he had likely never seen a family autopsy performed live in his conference room. I stepped back to the table. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood. Here is how this ends, I said. Everyone looked at me. Richard, Elaine, Megan, Miller, Sterling. I held the room in the palm of my hand. I am going to give you a choice, and it is the only choice you are going to get. I nodded to Laura. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her folder. It was a document we had drafted in the car on the way over, a memorandum of understanding. Option 1, I said. We proceed. I file the cross-complaint. I submit the forged power of attorney to the district attorney. I submit the evidence of the hush money payments to the police. Megan goes to jail, Richard goes to jail, and the name Anderson becomes synonymous with fraud across the entire state. Elaine let out a whimper. Richard closed his eyes. Option 2, I continued. You withdraw your lawsuit with prejudice immediately. You admit, on the record, that your claims were baseless. You agree to pay my legal fees in full within 30 days, and you sign this document. I slid the paper toward Richard. What is it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. It is a release, I said. It states that you will never contact me again. Not by phone, not by email, not by third party. It states that you will never attempt to claim any interest in my property or my assets, now or in the future. It states that if you ever speak my name to the press, or if you ever attempt to slander me to my employer, I will release the full file of evidence to the authorities immediately. I looked him in the eye. It is a permanent severance. You lose a daughter, but you keep your freedom. Richard looked at the paper. His hand shook as he reached for a pen. Mr. Miller leaned over. Sign it. Richard, do it now, before she changes her mind. Richard looked at Elaine. She was weeping into her hands, nodding frantically. She would trade her daughter for her reputation any day of the week. Richard looked at Megan. I am sorry, Meggie, he whispered. Megan didn't answer. She was staring at the wall, her face blank. She had realized too late that she was just a pawn in their game of appearances. Richard signed the paper. He pushed it to Elaine. She signed it without reading it. Then they pushed it to me. I picked up the pen. I looked at their signatures. The ink was wet. This was the end of my family. I was signing an orphan decree of my own making. But as I looked at the signatures, I felt a weight lift off my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was the relief of dropping a heavy pack after a long uphill march. I signed my name, Sophie Anderson. I handed the document to Laura. She checked it, nodded, and placed it in her briefcase. It is done, Laura said. Mr. Miller, you will file the withdrawal of the suit by 5 o'clock today? It will be filed within the hour, Miller promised. I looked at my parents one last time. They looked small. They looked like strangers. I hope the country club is worth it, I said. I turned and walked to the door. This time, nobody asked me to wait. This time, there was only the sound of Elaine's muffled sobbing and the scratching of a pen as Mr. Sterling notarized the death certificate of our relationship. I walked out into the hallway. The air was cooler out here. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. Laura stood beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer a platitude like I am sorry or are you okay? She knew me better than that. The elevator arrived. We stepped in. As the doors closed, shutting out the view of the conference room, I checked my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked the same. Same suit, same hair, same face. But everything had changed. I had walked in as a daughter being sued. I was walking out as a stranger who was free. I checked the time on my phone. It was 11:30. I can make it back to the office by noon. I said to Laura, I have a risk assessment to finish. Laura smiled. A small, sharp thing. You just finished the biggest risk assessment of your life. Sophie. Yes, I said, and I liquidated the liability. The elevator began its descent, carrying me down to the street, down to the real world, down to a life that finally, completely, belonged to me. The check for my legal fees arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 3 days before the deadline. It was a cashier's check, drawn from the dwindling remains of my parents' savings. I held the slip of paper in my hand, looking at the amount, $12,400. It covered Laura's retainer and the hours she had spent dismantling their lives. It was precise. It was cold. It was the final transaction of a relationship that had effectively ended years ago, even if I hadn't realized it until now. I deposited it via my mobile app. I did not send a thank you note. In the 30 days since the mediation, the silence from the suburbs had been absolute. The restraining order, formalized and filed, acted as a physical barrier, but the memorandum of understanding was the psychological wall. They knew that I held the nuclear codes. They knew that one phone call from me to the district attorney would turn their social embarrassment into a criminal conviction. Fear, it turned out, was a much more effective silencer than love ever was. I received updates through the grapevine, mostly from Chloe, who was still blissfully unaware of her role in exposing the truth. She texted me one afternoon, brimming with gossip. "Did you hear about Megan?" The text read, "She moved to Ohio. Can you believe it? She said she needed a fresh start. Something about a job in retail? I didn't think she even knew how to fold a shirt." I didn't reply, but I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Ohio. It was far enough. My parents had likely given her a one-way ticket and a small stipend, cutting their losses on the investment that had nearly bankrupted them. Megan was no longer the golden child. She was the liability that had been written off. She was finally going to have to learn how to survive without a safety net, without a crisis team, and without my money. It was the best thing that could have happened to her, though I doubted she saw it that way. As for my parents, the fallout was less geographical and more structural. I learned from a mutual acquaintance, a former neighbor who bumped into me at the grocery store, that my father had retired from his position on the country club board. Apparently, the dues had become too steep, or perhaps the whispers had already started. The neighbor mentioned that Richard looked tired, that he had lost that booming, confident air he used to carry like a shield. He had lost control. For a man like Richard Anderson, that was a fate worse than jail. He was now living in a house he could barely afford, with a wife who knew he was a fraud, and a daughter who had defeated him without raising her voice. He had tried to play the patriarch one last time, tried to sacrifice me to save his image, and in doing so, he had shattered the mirror he loved to look into. My mother, Elaine, was the one who surprised me. 2 weeks after the settlement, a package arrived at my building's front desk. It was not a bomb. It was a box of old photo albums, my baby pictures, my high school diploma, the ribbons I had won in track. There was no letter. There was no note begging for forgiveness. There was just a small, yellow sticky note attached to the cover of the top album. It read, in her shaky cursive, "These belong to you. We have no claim to them." It was an admission. It was the closest Elaine Anderson would ever come to an apology. By returning my history to me, she was acknowledging that I was a separate entity. She was admitting that I was not property to be leveraged, but a person who had walked away. She was admitting that I owed them nothing, not my money, not my house, and not my past. I took the box upstairs. I didn't cry. I placed it on the top shelf of my closet, next to my winter coats. I would look at them someday. Perhaps, but not now. Now. I was focused on the future. I sat on my balcony that evening. The city was alive below me, a grid of yellow and white lights breathing in the cool autumn air. I had a glass of wine in my hand, a vintage I had bought to celebrate a promotion, but which felt appropriate for celebrating my freedom. I looked around my apartment, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the clean gray lines of the furniture, the silence. For a week after the lawsuit was dropped, I had felt a phantom anxiety. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept waiting for the guilt to set in, for that old programming to kick in and tell me that I was a bad daughter, that I was selfish, that family is everything. But the guilt never came. Instead, I felt a profound sense of lightness. I realized that the heavy weight I had been carrying for years wasn't just the pressure of my job or the stress of the city. It was them. It was the constant, low-level hum of their expectation, the subtle manipulation that made me feel like my success was something I had to apologize for, something I had to share to be forgiven. I took a sip of wine. People talk about blood as if it is a magic binding agent. They say blood is thicker than water, But in my line of work, we know that contracts are thicker than blood. A contract is honest. It lays out the terms. It defines the risks. It has an exit clause. My family had tried to enforce a contract I never signed. They tried to claim equity they never earned. I had spent my life analyzing risk for corporations, protecting them from bad actors and hostile takeovers. It was ironic that the most hostile takeover attempt of my life had come from the people who gave me life. But I had treated it like any other case. I had removed the emotion. I had looked at the data. I had followed the money. And I had executed the strategy. I thought about the ending of that meeting in the conference room. I thought about the look on my father's face when he realized I knew about the forgery. It wasn't the look of a father who was disappointed. It was the look of a criminal who had been caught. That moment had been the death of my childhood, but it was the birth of my life. I was no longer Sophie the daughter, the provider, the backup plan. I was just Sophie. I finished my wine and stood up. I walked back inside and locked the balcony door. The click of the lock was solid and reassuring. I was safe. My assets were secure. My future was unwritten, and for the first time, the pen was entirely in my hand. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. I had a new client meeting in the morning, a tech firm looking to expand into volatile markets. They needed someone to tell them the truth about what could go wrong. They needed someone who could see the disaster before it happened. I smiled. I was very, very good at that. I closed the laptop and turned off the light. As I walked to my bedroom, I thought about the lesson I had left with my parents. They had wanted to teach me about duty. They had wanted to teach me about submission. But I didn't teach them with anger. I taught them with the truth. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It was a difficult journey, but sharing it has been a part of my liberation. I am really curious to know where you all are tuning in from right now. Are you listening on your commute, at the gym, or maybe relaxing at home? Please drop a comment below and tell me your location and what you would have done in my situation. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about justice and standing your ground, please subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories. Hit that like button to show your support, and press the hype button so this story can reach even more people who might need to hear it. Stay strong, and remember, your boundaries are worth fighting for.